They told me the rose bushes weren't uniform, that the lavender attracted bees, that my handmade gnome statues were unapproved art. And so, one spring morning, I opened my mailbox to find a crisp white envelope with my name, in bold, a $75 fine from the HOA for unauthorized landscaping. I laughed, then laughed again. They were serious. It wasn't just about a fine. It was a statement, a slap in the face after months of careful planning, sweat-soaked afternoons, and dirt under my fingernails. When you retire, people assume you're done with passion projects. But for me, that tiny 200 square foot patch of lawn was everything. I'd spent decades behind computer screens, sitting through mergers and acquisitions, slowly watching my life slide into PowerPoint presentations and airport lounges. Gardening was how I healed. When I bought the house, it was your standard cookie-cutter suburban lot. Square lawn, 2 trees that looked like they'd been copied and pasted, and mulch so faded it looked more like dirt. The HOA loved it that way. Bland, inoffensive, symmetrical. But I wanted something alive. I started with a single rose bush, a white one, just like the ones my wife adored. We used to visit a little rose garden back when we were young, barely affording rent, and she'd say, "One day I'll have my own." She passed before that day ever came. So I planted that rose bush for her, then another, then a row. Next came the lavender. Not only did it smell like peace itself, but it also brought bees and butterflies, tiny visitors that made the mornings magical. I planted thyme between the stepping stones, so it would release a warm, earthy scent when I walked across. I added trellises for climbing vines. I hand-built a wooden bench in the corner, nestled under a cherry tree I rescued from the clearance section of a local nursery. The tree had broken branches and yellowing leaves when I bought it, but it just needed care. A little sunlight, a little water, and a little belief. Then came the gnomes. I carved the first one myself, a chunky little guy holding a watering can, his beard half the size of his body. He reminded me of the wooden toys I used to whittle for my kids. Soon, I had a small collection. A painter gnome, a napping gnome, a book-reading gnome sitting cross-legged by the lavender. They weren't high art, but they made people smile. Kids would stop with their parents and point them out. "Look, Mommy, that one's sleeping." So you can imagine my surprise when that envelope came in the mail. I thought it was a mistake. HOA. Notices were usually about late dues or maybe a reminder about trash pickup. But no, there it was, bold and officious. Fine, $75. Violation, unauthorized landscaping, non-uniform hedges, use of non-approved flora, unregistered lawn art. I stared at it for a long time. Then I reread the HOA handbook, line by line. The approved landscaping list included exactly 5 types of shrubs, 1 variety of grass, and an uninspired list of plants that could survive an apocalypse but bring no joy. Apparently, lavender was not among them, nor were cherry trees. Gnomes, no mention, so clearly a gray area. I wasn't angry at first. I figured this was just some bureaucratic error. So I called. A woman answered, very chipper, like I was phoning. A hotel front desk. I explained the situation politely. I offered to send photos of the garden. I told her about the rose bushes, the bees, the way kids enjoyed the gnomes. Her tone shifted. She said, "Sir, the HOA has clear guidelines. If your lawn does not reflect community standards, fines will continue." I hung up and sat on my porch, fuming. Community standards? What community was this? I barely knew my neighbors. Half of them never came outside. The other half only came out to edge their lawns in perfect lines like they were manicuring golf courses. Was that community? A few days later, another envelope arrived. This time, 150, repeat violation. They'd added increased lavender growth and additional unapproved lawn decor. I had placed a little ceramic owl by the bird bath the week before. That was apparently the tipping point. Still, I didn't give up. I took pictures, clear, vibrant ones, and printed them into a booklet. I wrote a letter explaining the significance of each plant and ornament. I even offered to present my case in person at the next HOA board meeting. I wanted them to see the garden as more than plants. I wanted them to feel it the way I did. No, response. Just another envelope the following week, $300 this time. I was escalating violations. That phrase stuck with me, escalating, like I was some sort of suburban rebel inciting an uprising with daisies and mulch. By the end of the month, I'd racked up over $500 in fines. At that point, it wasn't even about the money. I had it, plenty of it. I'd made smart decisions in my career, invested early, saved well, lived below my means. I could pay every fine they threw at me, frame the letters, and keep planting flowers till the end of time. But it wasn't about that anymore. It was the principle, the arrogance, the way they tried to smother the very idea of joy, creativity, individuality. All for what? Some bland, outdated version of what a nice neighborhood should look like? They didn't know me. They didn't know I once negotiated 8-figure contracts in boardrooms where people didn't dare raise their voices. They didn't know I'd once outmaneuvered a Fortune 500 company trying to poach our intellectual property. They didn't know that when someone tries to beat me with rules, especially bad ones, I don't break. I build. So I sat under the cherry tree that afternoon, staring at the fine in my hand, the gnome smiling at me from the base of the tree, and I started to think, not about paying the fines, about buying the neighborhood. I started small. That's how all great takeovers begin, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with quiet, deliberate steps. The house next to mine had been on and off the market for nearly a year. The owner, a retired teacher named Linda, had been getting the same kinds of letters I was, fines for having too many wind chimes, for a bird feeder that encouraged pest activity, even for a porch swing that supposedly violated the approved color palette. She'd had enough. We'd talked over the fence a few times, and I could tell the HOA had worn her down. When she mentioned she was thinking of selling and moving in with her daughter, I saw an opening. I offered her a price slightly above market. No haggling, no inspections. We signed the paperwork in a week. Just like that, I owned the property next door. The HOA had no idea. Why would they? I used a trust for the purchase, kept it clean and boring on paper. To them, it looked like another routine sale. But to me, it was the first domino. I didn't just buy the house, I bought its vote. That's what they never considered. Every home in the neighborhood, regardless of who lives in it, gets one vote on HOA matters. One vote for board elections. One vote on amendments, on dues increases, on everything. Most residents didn't bother using theirs. People are busy. They work, raise kids, and don't care about meetings held in folding chairs under fluorescent lights. The board always won by default, by apathy. But I wasn't apathetic. I was strategic. The second house came up in a foreclosure auction. Young couple couldn't keep up with mortgage payments, and the HOA didn't lift a finger to help. In fact, they fined them for a garage door that didn't close flush. I showed up at the auction with a cashier's check and left with keys. Then came the third, and the fourth. The neighborhood wasn't as bulletproof as the board believed. Life happens, divorces, relocations, financial slips, and with every new house I bought, I brought in tenants. Not just random renters, but people I knew, or people who shared my vision. A single mom who ran a home bakery and wanted to plant herbs on her porch. A veteran who built birdhouses in his spare time. A young couple with a toddler who loved to finger paint on the sidewalk. I charged them below market rent on one condition: they show up to vote when it counted. We didn't call it a revolution, but it felt like one. I wasn't just collecting properties. I was planting seeds. Community potlucks started to pop up. I organized a tool-sharing board, rakes, mowers, wheelbarrows, all free to borrow. We painted a mural on one of the privacy fences, got the kids involved. Even residents I hadn't spoken to before started waving when I walked by. I wasn't enforcing order like the HOA board. I was building goodwill, one neighbor at a time. The board didn't notice the shift at first. Carl, the HOA president, still strutted around like he was a sheriff in an old western. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on his sunburnt forehead, always sniffing around for someone's trash can left out past noon or a bush that dared to grow an inch too wild. He caught wind of my ownership after house number 5. It wasn't hard. Someone probably mentioned seeing the same gardener at multiple properties. Or maybe it was when my tenants started showing up at meetings with printed agendas and notes. At the next board meeting, Carl tried to block me from speaking. Said I was just a homeowner, no different from anyone else. I smiled and calmly explained that I now represented 5 properties and therefore held 5 votes. The room went quiet. You could hear the cheap wall clock tick. His face turned pink. He fumbled with the bylaws, flipping through a binder like a magician with a rigged deck, trying to find some obscure clause that would disqualify me. But there wasn't one. The rules were clear. 1 vote per property. And every property I owned had submitted their proxy to me in writing. I wasn't just attending the meeting. I was taking the wheel. Still, I knew that owning properties and showing up wasn't enough. The real power came at the board election. And in our HOA, it happened. Every December, 3 board positions, rarely contested. Most residents never even opened the election email, let alone voted. So I ran. I didn't campaign the way Carl did, no stiff letters or dry statements. I walked the neighborhood. I talked to people on their lawns while they watered plants or took out trash. I asked about what they wanted. Less nitpicking, more freedom in their yards, a new playground, fewer fines. Everyone had a gripe. I designed flyers with color and humor. One had a cartoon of Carl measuring someone's grass with a ruler, with the slogan, "Is this really how we want to live?" I hand-delivered them. I held a free coffee and donuts event at the community center. Not a bribe, just connection. Election day came. I had 8 properties under my belt by then, 8 votes that couldn't be touched. But I didn't stop there. I had convinced others too. The single mom, the war vet, the quiet couple who'd been fined for having too many flower pots on their stoop. They voted. For the first time in years, people actually cared about the board election, and when the ballots were counted, it wasn't even close. I won a seat. So did a tenant of mine. The 3rd seat went to a neighbor who'd once been fined for painting his door teal. Carl was livid. He called it a coup, said I was manipulating the system. I reminded him that I was simply playing by the rules he helped write. He sulked through the meeting that followed. He tried to introduce a motion to limit the number of votes any one person could hold. It failed. And before the meeting ended, I introduced my first motion as a board member, a repeal of the approved landscaping restrictions. It passed. Carl had to watch as we reversed years of petty tyranny in a single night. Before the meeting ended, I handed him a violation notice of my own, $75 for excessive lawn flamingos. A joke, mostly, but it hit home, because now the board didn't belong to the rule enforcers anymore. It belonged to the people who actually lived there. And the neighborhood? It was finally starting to look like one. The very first thing I did, after taking control of the HOA board, was burn the landscaping rulebook. Not literally, though the image crossed my mind more than once, but figuratively, line by bureaucratic line. The approved shrubbery list? Gone. The regulation dictating grass height down to the millimeter? Deleted. The bizarre clause about only using natural toned ceramic lawn ornaments? Obliterated. For too long, those rules had turned our neighborhood into a lifeless museum display where everything looked the same and nothing felt alive. Instead, I introduced what I called the Gnome Liberty Act. Yes, the name was ridiculous. That was the point. I printed it on parchment style, paper, and posted it on every mailbox, bulletin board, and HOA announcement board in the neighborhood. It declared every homeowner's right to decorate, plant, and grow in a way that brought them joy. Within reason, of course. I wasn't opening the door to fire hazards or backyard junkyards. But flowers? Art? Whimsy? That was the new standard, the ba. Initial response was cautious. People had been living under the HOA's thumb for so long, they didn't trust that freedom would last. A few houses tested the waters. One neighbor added a row of sunflower planters along her porch, each pot painted with a different shade of blue. Another put up a small wooden trellis and let his clematis run wild. No fines, no warnings, just quiet acceptance. Then came the gnomes. Had a crate of them in my garage, my originals, plus a few I'd made since. One rainy afternoon, I left one on a neighbor's porch. No note, just a smiling gnome holding a sign that said "Grow Free." The next day, it was on their lawn. Then another appeared across the street. And another. Within a week, we had a dozen gnomes sprinkled throughout the neighborhood. Some handmade, some store-bought, some wildly customized. There was a gnome DJ spinning records, a gnome in a hammock, even a gnome dressed like a pirate. It became a thing. I leaned in. Started. A monthly gnome contest. Categories: most creative, best dressed, funniest pose. Winners got $25 gift cards or homemade jam from my tenant, Mrs. Winslow, who was thrilled to see people walking through her garden instead of reporting it. Residents who never attended an HOA meeting in their lives were suddenly showing up, laughing, mingling, even sharing gardening tips. Still, there were holdouts. The old guard, the ones who believed a neighborhood should be quiet, polished, and dull, saw me as a threat. Carl, in particular, would show up to meetings just to grumble from the back row. He wasn't on the board anymore, but he still had a voice, and he used it to accuse me of destroying the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity, whatever that meant. I ignored him. Mostly, until the day he tried to get people stirred up over money. The new board, he said in a letter he slipped into people's mailboxes, has no idea how to manage the budget. They're spending without restraint. Soon we'll all be drowning in fees. He was right about one thing. We were spending. But unlike the old board's obsession with repainting fences and enforcing uniform trash bins, our spending actually went toward the residents. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I raised the dues by 300%. It sounds outrageous on paper, and I knew it would ruffle feathers. But I did it the right way. I held open forums. I laid out a budget. I showed exactly where the money was going. Community gardens, free Wi-Fi for every home, solar-powered street lamps, a small scholarship fund for neighborhood teens heading to college. Every household got a flyer with a breakdown, color-coded. Simple language, no fine print. I personally knocked on doors, answered questions, drank lukewarm coffee in too many kitchens, just to make sure people understood it wasn't about greed. It was about investment. We were going to build something fitter. And slowly they came around, even the skeptical ones. Especially when they saw the first changes appear, changes they could touch and use. We repurposed the abandoned tennis court into a pop-up market space where residents could sell baked goods, crafts, even fresh vegetables. We installed benches along the main walking path, hand-carved by a retired carpenter who'd lived in silence on our street for years until someone asked about his tools. We built a community garden. Not a sad little patch of dirt, but a real, vibrant space with raised beds, compost bins, and a sign-up sheet for weekend harvests. Kids learned how to grow tomatoes. Seniors swapped stories while pulling weeds. The smell of basil and damp soil filled the air on summer mornings, and yes, we kept the gnome theme alive. Every new project included at least one gnome hidden somewhere, behind a rain barrel, under a lavender bush, perched atop the garden gate. It became our symbol, our quiet rebellion. Some neighbors cried the first time they saw kids drawing chalk, murals on the sidewalks, and not being yelled at. Others sat in the little park and marveled at the sound of live guitar music drifting from someone's front porch instead of another angry lawnmower. There were birthday parades, sidewalk poetry, nights, spontaneous yoga sessions. Was it perfect? No. We had complaints. One guy insisted the wind chimes were too spiritual. Another lady hated the smell of mulch. A few tried to rally against the dues. But the majority stood by me, not because they loved me, but because they finally felt seen, heard, included. And somewhere in the middle of it all, something beautiful happened. People started talking again. Over fences, across driveways, around bonfires in their front yards. The isolation that had once cloaked our block like fog began to lift. We weren't just neighbors, we were a community. I caught Carl sneaking into the community garden one morning, early, when he thought no one was around. He bent down and picked a ripe tomato, turned it over in his hand like he didn't quite know what to make of it. I didn't say anything, just watched from a distance. That single moment was more satisfying than any petty fine I could have issued. The thing is, I never set out to be in charge. I didn't want power. I wanted peace. I wanted to plant without being punished, to celebrate color in a world that kept trying to paint everything gray. But somewhere along the line I realized that joy is contagious, and if you defend it fiercely enough, it spreads. We weren't just the neighborhood with the weird HOA president anymore. We became known as that community with the gnomes. Local papers started calling. A reporter interviewed me while we stood under the cherry tree I planted years ago, the one that started it all. She asked what my vision was when I took over. I smiled and said, I just wanted people to stop being afraid of their own front yards. And that's exactly what happened. When the news broke, it wasn't even me who shared it. One of the local bloggers caught wind of what was happening. In our neighborhood, an HOA turning fun, gardens replacing grass, murals blooming where fences used to be beige. The headline read, How One Homeowner Took Over the HOA and Gave It Back to the People. I didn't even know the article. Had run until my phone buzzed nonstop for 2 days. At first I panicked. I thought, this is it. Carl's going to sue me for defamation or misappropriation or some legal buzzword he's got bookmarked on his laptop. But the calls weren't angry. They were curious. Some were from other neighborhoods, other states even. People desperate to know how I did it, how they could do the same. Others were from local residents who had never really paid attention until now. Suddenly, people wanted in. The next HOA meeting had more chairs than ever before. We had to move it out of the old rec room and onto the lawn outside the community center. Someone brought a Bluetooth speaker and played music while we waited. Kids ran around with chalk. We handed out lemonade and ginger cookies baked by one of our neighbors who'd just started a side hustle. It didn't look like a homeowners meeting. It looked like a picnic. I stood up to speak, not from behind a table or microphone, but just standing on a small step stool so I could be seen over the crowd. I didn't bring notes. I didn't rehearse. I just looked around at all the faces, people, who once were strangers, or worse, enemies, and I told them the truth. I don't want to be your boss, I said. I want to be your neighbor. That's it. That little speech got applause, but more importantly, it got volunteers. People started offering time, tools, skills. A retired electrician offered to upgrade wiring for the community center for free. A high schooler who'd just finished a summer coding class helped us set up a slick new neighborhood website. A stay-at-home dad with a drone made videos of our gardens and events, and they went viral on Instagram. Even the people who were initially skeptical, especially the ones who thought raising dues would spark chaos, started seeing the change. The property values were going up, but more than that, the value of living here was going up. Residents who'd been planning to sell now wanted to stay. We had waiting lists for the rentals. Realtors started advertising our neighborhood with Phrases like HOA run with community focus and resident-powered charm. But success comes with challenges. As our little community gained attention, other HOA boards took notice. Some were impressed, others were furious. I got a cease and desist letter from a lawyer representing an HOA 2 towns over, claiming I was slandering the traditional HOA model by suggesting ours was better. I ignored it. Then came the influx of people who wanted to move in, not to be part of the community, but to exploit the goodwill. Investors offered to buy properties at double the price. Developers knocked on my door, promising splashy upgrades in exchange for limited commercial zoning exceptions. One offered to sponsor the community garden in partnership with a national brand. He even brought mock-ups, sunflowers with corporate logos printed on the petals. I said no to all of them. This wasn't about branding or profit. This was about reclaiming space, for joy, for families, for life. We weren't a product. We were a home. Still, not everything was roses and rainbows. Conflict still found its way in. There were disagreements over the mural themes. Someone didn't want dogs in the park. Another complained that the bongo player on Saturday mornings was too loud. But here's the difference. We talked about it. We set up a conflict resolution circle, real chairs in real circles, with people listening instead of shouting. Sometimes we compromised. Sometimes we didn't. But no one got fined. No one got a threatening letter. We found middle ground in ways the old board would have never considered. The final showdown with Carl didn't come at a meeting. It came on a Tuesday afternoon in the grocery store of all places. I was standing in the produce aisle, looking at apples, when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. "I see your little kingdom's thriving," he said. He looked tired. Not in a sickly way, but like a balloon that had been slowly deflating for a while. He wasn't carrying a clipboard, just a bag of rice and some bananas. "It's not a kingdom," I said. "It's a neighborhood." He scoffed but didn't walk away. "You know, some of us were just trying to keep order. We weren't the bad guys." "I know that," I said, but it stopped feeling like order. It felt like control. People got scared of their own yards. He paused, nodded slowly. "I saw the tomato garden. It's nice." That was the closest thing to an apology I ever got from him. And honestly, it was enough. That night I walked through the neighborhood. As the sun dipped low and the string lights flickered on, I saw the toddler next door giggling on the porch, wearing a pirate hat and pointing at a gnome with a tiny telescope. A couple danced barefoot on their front lawn, music pouring out from a Bluetooth speaker. A teen painted a new corner of the sidewalk with swirls of color and stars. I stopped by the garden and watered a few beds. Someone had left a note by the basil. "Best pesto I've ever had. Thank you." I smiled, folded the note into my pocket. I never imagined this when I first got fined for my garden. Back then, I just wanted to plant something green without getting a letter for it. But now I looked around and saw what we'd grown. Not just flowers or vegetables or painted fences, but connection, joy, and something harder to name, but stronger than rules. We weren't perfect, but we were free. And maybe that was the greatest revenge of all.